Hi, welcome back to the lore of DBD killers. And the next one I want to speak about is the plague. In the game, she's a very good killer. She's got very good powers, and it can weaken the characters to the point where they can't heal themselves anymore, and they have to rely on healing themselves at fountains. But this in turn can actually give the plague power. So yeah, she's a very difficult character to play against. So she was actually called I think it's Adiris. I'm not sure, I could be completely getting that wrong. I tried so many times and failed. When she was 5, Adarius was left on the steps of the Temple of Purgation, and in her way to process the grief and the shock of, how she was left, she kept it in her mind that God had a plan for her, and she stuck to tending the temple and the area around it to give her a meaning and giving her something to focus on. And then as she got older, the plague became more rampant in the world around her, and the priests and everyone in the temple that were healing people started to need more help. And Adiris was getting to that point, getting to that age where she could become part of that. So it was the day of her very first her first day, when the ceremony was going to take place, and she was really nervous, and she kept asking for a sign that this was the right thing to do. And she had to go to a chamber to prepare, and she was praying when she noticed there was a small entry in the back of the chamber that she didn't know was there. And she went through this entryway, and she found a small cove, and there was a statue, a golden statue of a woman with her arms outstretched. And that's when Adiris believed she had been given the sign that she needed and she could carry on. And she went out amongst all the people. There was this one person in particular, and she was very sick with the plague. She was full of the blotches, and she was very weak, and she could barely walk. And with no explanation, Adiris went to this woman, and she chopped off one of her toes as an offering to the gods to help this woman, and she began to get better. And a lot of people started to follow Adiris and believe in her, and she felt high and mighty and strong, and she barely noticed at that time she started suffering from the plague herself. And out of fear that it was going to spread further, Adiris volunteered to leave where she was, leave the temple, leave the area, effectively banish herself with a few people that wanted to go with her, a few of her followers. And they walked, and slowly everyone got sick. They were in a bad way. And they found the way to a cave, and they stayed in this cave, and no one found Adiris. No one knew what became of her, but that was the beginning of her story. up next is the Oni. And in the game, he's a good killer. He can be very, very good. With a bit of practice, he can down pretty much anybody. He was called Kazan Yamayoga, and his father, he wasn't anymore, but he used to be a very strong samurai warrior. He was strong, he was undefeated, he was everything his son wanted to be, and he saw it as an insult to the samurai nature that farmers were claiming to be samurais now, putting the name, dragging it through the mud. So he wanted to rid the world of that, and his father did everything he could to distract Kazan away from this way of thinking, but nothing seemed to work. And in the end, Kazan took a katana sword and he went on a very dark kind of pilgrimage to rid the world of anyone who claimed to be a samurai and insulted the word. He went through dozens of farmers and it was brutal, it was morbid. He did everything he could to take back the name, and he was seen as taking it to a very dark place, and he wasn't doing it for honour's sake anymore. He was just doing it for the sake of wanting to. So he earned the nickname Oni Yamaoka, and it was seen as a very big insult to him that he was called that, because he felt like he'd earned his rightful place as a samurai by, defending the honour of being a samurai. And then one day he was on his way back to his home and he came across a fully in all the clothing samurai, and he couldn't see his face. All he knew was this was an opponent that he had to bring down like the others. So he did just that. He completely overpowered this samurai and unalived, well, he thought he unalived him, and he lifted the samurai's hat, and to his horror it was his father, and he'd done the unthinkable, and all he could do was close his eyes and scream for all what he did and for all that he just lost, and how he just lost the one person that he was in his mind doing it for. And then when he finally opened his eyes, he'd been in a kind of stupor, and he opened his eyes and it kind of hit home. Finally he'd lost his father, and while he was in that state, thieves had come and stole all his armour. So he basically just had his clothes. So he went through that town doing, exacting justice for what had happened, getting all these things back. And it got to a point where he'd gone through nearly everyone in the town, and he came upon the town's lord, and he unalived the lord, which was a very serious thing to do. So he came outside, and everyone still alive had pitchforks, they were shouting, they were ready to hunt him down. So he fought as best he could, and for a little while he actually held his own and survived. But he was overpowered. There were so many people and only one of him, and he eventually was overpowered, and the last thing he saw was a dark, dark sky, and no one ever found his body or the body of his father or his son ever again. Next is Deathslinger. Deathslinger is very good in the game. He has a ranged attack, he has a spear gun, which can be terrifying when it's used properly, and it can take people out very quickly. I've only played this in once now, particularly wasn't very good, but I know it can be a very, very good killer to play. In real life, well, in the DBD life, he was called Caleb, and he was the son of an Irish worker, and he saw famine and violence and all sorts of things, and because of the situation, Caleb's father stopped working and pretty much down tools, but he started to notice that Caleb took a special interest in building and inventing, so he gifted Caleb his old wrench. Now, what his father didn't know was the inventions that Caleb thought up were very bloody and violent. He invented things to torture people, and eventually he was found and took under the wing of someone called Bradshaw, and he started to build things that weren't quite as violent but were very helpful, railroad guns and drills and things like that. And eventually his employer took credit for that, and that really upset Caleb. He invented the spear gun, which is his weapon in the game, and he went to his bosses in his work and he beat his boss basically to a pulp. He was in a very bad way, and he shot him with the spear gun, thinking that he'd unalived his boss. So in the end, it turned out it was very unlikely, but his boss actually survived. He was very disfigured, but he lived. So instead of being hung for murder, Caleb was sent to prison. And when he was in prison, he developed a friendship with the warden. He had someone to speak to, and he told the warden about his love of inventing, and they sorted it so that he could still do that while he was in prison. And the warden saw how impressive his inventions were, and he basically stole them. And Caleb saw in a newspaper that his employer was shaking hands with the warden, and he had taken over the patent for it. So one day he became part of a gang in the prison, and they organised what was like a riot, and they burst into the warden's office, where he found both his old employer and the warden, and he unalived them. And before they passed, he took them into the mess hall and left them amongst the crowd of angry prisoners, and he went back to his cell exhausted and spent and angry, and he just sat on his bed staring into space, and he didn't even notice the fog that was slowly coming into the cell and surrounding him to take him to where he presides now. Next is the Blight. The Blight in the DBD world is a very good killer. He can pivot off obstacles, which means he can take down survivors very fast. He's a very good killer for that reason. He was called Talbot before he became the Blight, and he was he excelled in terms of like medical, and it got to a point where he was so clever in his work, he was accepted into a school of medicine, and he just kept working harder and harder there, and it got to a point he discovered a medicine that would allow workers to work faster but not feel any side effects from that. And because of such an amazing find, he was gifted a secret laboratory, and it just so happens this was underneath a prison camp. So the prisoners and soldiers of war, they all became his test subjects for this. And again, he worked very hard until he travelled to India to continue his work, and he was blindfolded, beat over the head and put into a wagon. And then when he woke up and he had his blindfold taken off, he was shown a mass grave. All of the people he'd been testing and all the people who'd taken this drug to work faster, it had unalived them eventually, because it was something where you would only see the side effects after a long time. So he was beaten, and they thought he wasn't there anymore. He was thrown into a mass grave with all of the people that had been casualties to what he'd done, and he was close to passing when he was finally rescued, and he woke up in a comfortable bed, and someone was tending his wounds and he, making him stronger. And when he was strong enough, they explained that they were they were a cult, but they were seen as a monkhood, and their chief, like their main objective, was to develop something that would allow them to open the door to another, like a higher way of living, a higher way of seeing. And so that's what he went to work creating. And because they saw firsthand all of the things he was doing and accomplishing, they started to turn on him, and they were trying different drugs on him, and unfortunately they weren't as successful as they would have been. So they brought him close to being unalived again, and that was how he encountered the mist that took him over and made him the Blight. The next lore I'd like to talk about is very sad, but I think it is one of those that makes you think, and it's the twins. Now, in the world of DBD, a lot of people say that they're an easy killer to get around, and some people still think they're quite difficult to get around. I think it just depends on the person, really. So it starts with the mother, and she goes through a difficult labour and she gives birth to Charlotte. Now Charlotte was born with a conjoined twin who was conjoined through the chest, and he was called Victor. And the mother loved Charlotte and Victor. They loved her and they loved each other, and they were all they had. And because of the nature of the birth and the nature of the twins, they were seen, well, the mother was seen as a witch and they were seen as freaks. So they were basically outcast. They had to live in the woods. Charlotte would go out and steal food and then take it back to the woods, and they would sleep where they could find. And you know, there was always danger of being caught, but they were very good at evading it, until one night they went to sleep in a rickety old cabin, and they woke up in the middle of the night to torchlight all around them, and they were dragged out the cabin by an army of men in black cloaks. And they took the mother and they burned her as a witch. And unfortunately they forced Charlotte and Victor to witness everything. And then they took Charlotte and Victor. Now everything happy had gone, and you know, they were upset and they were lost that they'd lost the mother. But the people in the black cloaks were trying an experiment. They would bleed them out sometimes, you know, certain amounts. They would make them sleep with twigs under the pillows, you know, a number of strange things. And then one day it came to the ultimate thing where they were going to unalive them. And they took them to a pedestal, and they stood over them both with a knife, and they realised what was going to happen. So Charlotte rolled off the table before anything could happen. Sorry. And sorry, I nearly dropped my phone. And she managed to knock a candelabra flying, and it set fire to the curtains of where they were, and it quickly spread. And during that time, Charlotte managed to get up off the podium and the table, the altar, and ran and escaped back to the woods. And unfortunately, in this struggle, Victor passed away. Which left Charlotte heartbroken. She'd lost basically everything. So all she could do was carry on as she was, but it was so much harder now. It was just her. It was hard to steal food. It was hard to find somewhere to shelter. She basically slept by a campfire in the woods, and she lived in fear that the people in the black cloaks would come back again, but luckily that never happened. And then one night Charlotte fell asleep by the fire, and she was woken by a strange feeling in her chest, and then to her shock and surprise, as she woke up, Victor freed himself from her and ran off into the woods screaming. And Charlotte couldn't quite believe her eyes. In a week's day it must have felt like a dream, but she gave chase and she ran after him shouting his name, and that was the last time anyone saw Victor and Charlotte ever again. And now they roam Dead by Daylight world. Next up is Trickster, and he's another killer in DBD. He's quite he can be quite a good killer. It's very hard to evade him. He has throwing knives as a weapon, and it means that it's very hard to find a hiding place from him. So with a lot of practice, he can actually be a good killer to play. Trickster's real name was Ji Woon Hook, I believe that's the pronunciation, and he thrived on attention from a very early age. He loved having a crowd and drawing people's attention in. And as he got older, he would work as entertainment for the people in his parents' restaurant, believing it was an actual tradition. People would watch him performing stunts with throwing knives, and they would cheer. And because he was doing so well, his father spent the earnings from the restaurant on singing and dancing lessons for him. And it worked out. He was very, very good. And it got to a point when he met a producer called Yoon Jin Lee, and that's actually a survivor. I'm gonna go a bit more into that in another video. But she selected him to go on a training program into a dormitory in Seoul. And he thrived there as well. And she got him a place in a band called No Spin. And he was the vocalist, and he loved the attention, and it was going great. But over time, it started to grow a bit stale for him, and he started to see the fame that he was getting as split amongst the 5 band members when he wanted the attention on himself. And then one day, what he thought was fate struck, and the wires used in the studio to record the band caught fire before he could be there, and the bandmates were trapped inside because some speakers fell in front of the door and locked them in. And all he could hear was them yelling his name, asking for him to let them out. But to him, it felt like validation and attention because they were cheering his name. And he realised what he had to do to get the attention he wanted. And eventually, because he was on his own from that point, he wasn't bringing in as much revenue as he would normally, and Yoonjin started wondering if they could carry on, and he was craving attention again like he did before. So he started kidnapping people and taking them to places where they wouldn't be found while he had them, and he would unalive them, but he was cocky with it, and he would leave things so that people would know it was a singer that was causing this to happen. He would leave feather boas around people, and things just to make the police think. And eventually, it got to the point where he was working on his own, so he wasn't doing as well as he once was, and he wasn't gaining the fame that he once did, and he wanted to be the centre of everything again. So he decided he had to create his masterpiece. And over the next few months, he collected canisters of nitrous oxide, and he used that to kidnap a lot of people. And he took them back to the studio, and the final piece of the puzzle was Yunjin Lee. She had basically made him who he was. So in his mind, he wanted her to be the centre of his masterpiece. So he tied her up in the middle of the room, and he opened her eyes with something he made her look, and he took each person and he systematically tortured these people along to music so that it would sound like the cries of, in time to music. And he unalived people, and finally, when it was all done, he was stood in the middle of the room covered in the evidence of what he'd done, and he was tired and he was sweaty, and he'd spent himself doing all this kind of thing. And Hyunjin was the final person alive, and he went to untie her to make her the final part of it, and that's when the fog descended from the sky into the room, and this time the fog surrounded them both and took them to the place where the entity ruled over them.